Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our episode discussing professional services M&A with Chris Brown and Jason Phillips. Now, last time we did a podcast series, we had a couple of podcasts focusing on M&A deals, and in particular, in those we talked quite a bit about due diligence and what due diligence is, what the process looks like from a lawyer's point of view, why it's important, and how to carry out a successful due diligence. Now, in the context of buying or selling or transacting in a professional services firm, Chris, as we would both see, there can be a variety of different legal structures that a professional services firm might be run in. It could be a corporate structure, it could be a non-corporate structure, it could be a partnership, etc., etc. So when we are approaching a due diligence process from a legal point of view of a professional services firm, what are some of the key issues that turn up? What are some of the key points that we have to be mindful of? And what does the process look like? And how might it be different to what you would be doing for any other business?
Yeah, sure, Frank. The first point to pick up on your starting point there was around structure, and obviously the existing operating structure, and whether that remains the structure immediately prior to transaction or whether there's a restructure. That existing structure, if it stays in place through to the point where the business is transacted, will obviously inform the transaction structure, how the deal is done. So I would say, there's probably still quite a lot of partnership act, old-fashioned professional partnerships out there in this sector, and that would sort of lead the transaction to being conducted by way of asset or business or asset transfer. So a little bit fiddlier. You don't buy the full box and dice, but at the same time, there's sort of advantages in that the liability, the legal liability at least, is left behind. But probably a more difficult transaction to execute. So clearly, existing operating structure and how that informs the transaction structure will be top of the list for due diligence. And then sort of drilling down into the business itself and where we see the risks. Well, I mentioned a few minutes ago the key person risk. These are people, businesses. Very often the goodwill is attached very much to the individuals who have created the business and who are driving it forward in the here and now. So we need to make sure that we've thoroughly reviewed their contracts, and the change of control, the change of ownership doesn't trigger some entitlement. I'm just sort of giving some examples here. Some entitlement to participate in equity, for instance, or an entitlement to a golden parachute payment, probably unlikely in the context of professional services. But I guess more proactively, how are we going to ensure that these people are locked in? If they decide that they're not going to transfer over with the business, how are we going to ensure that they're not competing against the business, which is probably their right, unless there was some provision in their contract for services which prevented them or restricted them from doing so. So the contracts of key employees and other significant staff are a focus in legal due diligence. Thirdly, claims history and the availability of insurance. So how are any unknown issues affecting this business which could come back in the future post completion to bite it and to affect and undermine the goodwill that we've acquired? How can they be dealt with? And is this an issue based on the claims history and the breach history that we've seen in due diligence? So finally, those three issues are very important. Finally, in this sector, and also in financial services, wealth management, we see a lot of joint ventures, collaboration agreements, and referral arrangements. So they need to be thoroughly due diligenced from the purchaser's point of view, because obviously the purchaser will have their own arrangements of that ilk. And whatever the seller or the target entity has committed to, we need to make sure that they're not completely inconsistent with what the purchaser also has in place.
Excellent. So, Chris, I think we're really hitting on four big things there. And the first is structure. The second is employees and employment agreements. The third is insurance, very important in professional services firm. And the fourth is clients and existing arrangements. And those things are all critical elements of any transaction, but a professional services transaction in particular. And Jason, you're probably the person actually doing a lot of this. What are some of your observations, having been in the cut and thrust of many deals and many due diligence processes?
Well, I very much agree with the key points that Chris has pointed out. However, before I go on, and we do get engaged to do due diligence, and but I'd say, if we're acting in a transaction role, as you'd appreciate, we wouldn't be carrying out the due diligence on the assets we sell. But due diligence, as far as professional services and particularly accounting is concerned, it's a bit like a plumber with a leaking tap. It's done very poorly, generally speaking. So I just want to point out that that is very much the case that we would see over having done transactions for good part of 25 years. I would generally say that other sectors are much better executed on the due diligence side than that of accounting firms or professional services more generally. In regards to the key points that Chris has raised, as I said, I certainly agree with them. I think people sometimes underestimate the personal goodwill that's attached to senior staff, and it is important to review their contracts, and it is important to take into consideration that they are typically not a party to the transaction. So rights and obligations of both purchaser and vendor are quite different, which no doubt Chris can add to that. So that's important. And in understanding the joint venture arrangements and referral arrangements. And this is particularly important in financial planning, but it's linked to accountants as well, because often they are a party to those types of arrangements, and what rights and obligations are applied to each one of those parties is absolutely vital as part of that process.
That's great, Jason. So, Chris, Jason, we've mentioned this a couple of times now, but that in the context of a professional services firm, key person risk is more pronounced and a more important issue than it might be if we were dealing in a different kind of business. So can we just talk through a little bit about how that key person risk in the context of a transaction involving a professional services firm is managed? What are some of the legal and commercial strategies that are used, to keep a former professional services firm principal motivated to transition their client base and motivated to ensure the success of the post-transaction business?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that buyers will be looking to put in place here to ensure that the selling principals, to the extent they're still engaged in the business, particularly those kind of principles, are as aligned as possible with the success of the purchaser group, the expanded purchaser group. So first and foremost, the most effective tools available are commercial tools or financial tools. So we very often see seller principals retaining significant or not insignificant equity stakes in the sold business. That's probably the most effective form of alignment, particularly if there's a check waiting for them at the end of a sort of 2 or 3 year period, to validate the growth and to reward them for obviously hopefully sensible growth of the business. Allied to that are so-called earnouts or retentions, or rise-fall arrangements, which also serve a similar purpose. They are there to, within reason and within sensible bounds, keep the selling principal focused on the financial health of the business, but also moderate or decent growth in the short to medium term. So those financial tools are very often there as an incentive, but also potentially as a stick, as a carrot and stick, and that's the sort of retention component of effectively holding back some of the consideration, and that's quite often used as security for warranties, for example, or as security for tacit security, if you like, for compliance with the restraints. Which brings me conveniently to restraints. So restraints or non-competes, non-solicits, non-interference provisions are also key, and it's an important part of our role when we're acting for buyers to ensure that sellers don't just sort of nip round the corner after they've taken a sort of decent-sized holiday or sabbatical and rehang the shingle and start going head-to-head with the business that they've sold to our client, the buyer in this case.
Excellent. And what about you, Jason?
Well, we would certainly see similar scenarios. Restraints are important, and how you structure them commercially is open to whether you're the purchaser and obviously the vendor. If you're the purchaser, you do want to make sure that the restraints are addressed and the vendor acts accordingly. And there may be some commercial machinations in the contracts that would require the vendor to acquire back those fees if they choose to service them within the restraint period. Conversely, if people are expecting to be paid an amount outstanding, then you'd expect that the full terms, including the restraints, to apply. And if they weren't, if the contract wasn't to be honoured, the payments weren't going to be paid, then some of those terms, including the restraints, may vary. So they're the sort of things that you'd want to implement as a commercial arrangement, and certainly focus on maintaining that key person. Those key person risks are attached to the business. Going forward, as I mentioned, prices or values have increased as well. Just one thing that Chris noted upon on rise and falls. The provision of rise provisions are not as frequent over the last 12 to 18 months, I've noticed. There's certainly falls, but the ability to get an upside on an overall consideration is becoming harder for vendors. Often they may receive bonus arrangements as part of an ongoing consultancy to tie them into the business as employees for a period, but often it's limited to fall provisions. So if you don't achieve your warranted revenue target, then some of the consideration that may have been withheld on completion won't be paid, or a pro rata of that won't be paid going forward.
That's great insight from both of you, and I imagine this would be one of the elements of a deal that would be the most hotly negotiated and contested, and that would really make or break a deal. So no, that's been both of you have made some excellent points there. Thank you very much. So moving away, we've talked a lot about some of the hard legal and tax issues that you would confront and deal with and try and manage in a deal like this. What I'd like us to sort of talk about as we sort of close out this session is, both of you have done lots of deals involving professional services firms, and oftentimes with those firms, you've gone on to assist and to advise them after the transaction has happened, and they've become long-standing clients. So just from your observation and from your experience, what are some of the key things that have made successful transactions successful, and what are some of the issues that have made less successful transactions turn out the way that they did?
Sure. I think one of the key aspects of any transaction is communication between the parties, and that, I mean, people talk about cultural alignment and the like, but it really comes down to how do you communicate between buyer and seller, and if the communication's open and transparent and sometimes frank, as it should be, then typically you would have naturally a cultural alignment between buyer and seller, and that it helps going forward. It helps in the transition. It helps when areas of disagreement, and sometimes they arise. You can't. It'd be foolish to suggest that you'd never disagree. That those aspects are better managed when there is open communication through the process prior to executing a transaction. And I think that's really quite important to get that alignment, and not, if you're a purchaser, not be afraid to show the vendor that there may be changes, but to actually justify and demonstrate why those changes could be beneficial for the vendor's clients and their staff, and for them themselves if they're continuing to work in the business. So that's important. It's just springing changes on someone after the deal's been done often creates a lot of tension unnecessarily, in my experience.
Excellent. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. I mean, you said at the top, Frank. We've each gone on to advise the buyer or the seller, but that's likely the buyer, given the sort of continuity piece. After the deal has been done, the preferred situation is not to have to advise them on the sale and purchase agreement, because if we don't get that out of the filing cabinet, that means that it's been successful and everything's gone according to plan. So that's certainly the hope on every transaction, and we've got quite a good strike rate on that front. But look, I mean, I don't think you can. Jason touched on the cultural alignment piece, and maybe played it down a little bit. So maybe what I'm about to say doesn't have anything to do with cultural alignment. Maybe it's more do your soft due diligence. If and quite often this is probably overlooked, because someone selling their business perhaps won't be in the business in 2 or 3 years' time. They are retiring. So the cynical part of me, we might need to expunge what I'm about to say from the podcast record, but the cynical part of me probably thinks, well, why would they really care what happens in 2 or 3 years' time? But I think a lot of sellers do care. But a lot of people, probably because there's a process and they sort of deliver themselves up to advisors like me and Jason, sort of, in a way, take leave of the whole judgment piece around, am I selling this business to the right person? Can I live with this person for the next 2 to 3 years during the earn-out? Am I happy delivering my staff up to this person? Would I go into business with this person? Perhaps not the best analogy, but would I go into business with this person if I was starting from scratch? And I think, I mean, that's a sort of cultural alignment issue, but it's also a personality issue, and it's also a soft due diligence issue. And I think the deals which have gone quite well, or have gone very well, have been those where, whilst we have different personalities on each side of the table, they both have respect for each other in the way in which they've sort of owned and operated their businesses, and they end up actually working quite well with each other, admittedly for the most part in the short to medium term, whilst the previous owner is transitioning out of the business.
I would just add to that, Frank, in the sense that Chris came from a vendor's perspective, and it's absolutely vital that the vendor needs to appreciate what the business or the purchaser, what their operations are and how they approach and engage with clients. But at the same time, as a purchaser, the same amount of effort needs in the soft skills and the soft due diligence needs to be applied to the vendor, because from my experience, really dealing with a vendor, particularly a sole practitioner, is looking through the mirror to their clients. It's looking through the looking glass, if you'd like, to see, well, if the vendor carries on a certain way, it's more likely that their clients will engage in a certain way as well. And from a purchaser's perspective, that's important, but the clients engage with the purchaser in a way that fits with the purchaser's objectives.
Well, that's all very important insight there. And we always say, whether it's in our business at Hall & Wilcox or in Jason's, that it is very much a relationship business, and it is dependent on the relationships that we have as a partner group. And it's our collective success that really matters. And I think collectively we've recorded a very successful podcast today. So my very sincere thanks to Jason as our special guest for taking the time and sharing his insight with us today. And and with my very esteemed colleague who I trust implicitly, and if it was day one, would not hesitate for a second to go into business with him, Mr. Christopher Brown. And as always, I'd like to close out by thanking everyone who tuned in and listened to our podcast today. As always, please don't hesitate for 1 nanosecond to get in touch if you have any questions which have come up because of this podcast. As I say, we will be putting down details for Jason and also for Chris when we publish this podcast on our website. You can find more information about Hall and Wilcox on our website, which is Hall and Wilcox, HALLANDWILCOX.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, and I hope that you have, then please rate, review, or follow our podcasts through whatever channel you get your podcasts from. Thank you once again, and look forward to being with you next time.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.